Hello and welcome to The Context USA with me, Katrina Perry in Washington.
And me, Helena Humphrey in London. Tonight we are focusing on the latest US action in the war in Iran as the US launches new strikes.
Like anything with something like this, and it's going to take a couple days to settle on, even down to the disagreements over a word.
There appears to have been progress on not an overall deal, but on this one-page memorandum of understanding where essentially they work out what it is they need to discuss.
Well, they've been very carefully characterized as self-defense, defensive in nature, so therefore the ceasefire is still in effect.
They did not imagine that our armed forces, our defensive power and our offensive system could perform such feats.
Joining us on the panel tonight, Republican strategist John Thomas and former Deputy Assistant Secretary of State and author Joel Rubin. Hello and welcome to The Context USA. Well, we are starting with the situation in Iran as a peace deal between the United States and Iran, which seemed to be within touching distance just a couple of days ago, remains elusive. The prospects of an agreement have not been helped by this latest flare-up in the Gulf.
Well, the United States has launched what it is calling defensive strikes to protect its troops from the threat of Iranian forces. Now, the strikes in southern Iran targeted missile sites and vessels that were trying to lay mines.
Iran has now accused the US of violating the ceasefire agreement. It claims its air defense units shot down an American drone and fired at a warplane. And its military has warned it would trigger a wider, more violent retaliation.
Now, President Trump has not posted about the Iran situation today. He was occupied earlier with his annual physical exam, which he later posted about, saying that, quote, everything checked out perfectly. The Secretary of State, Marco Rubio, has said that US strikes on Iran would not affect the peace talks.
I think there's strong alignment and agreement on what a preliminary draft should look like. I think that, like anything with something like this, and it's going to take a couple days to settle on, even down to the disagreements over a word, sentence. So we'll have to work through that. If there's going to be a deal, we're going to have to work through that. But this is, it's either going to be a good deal or there isn't going to be one.
Well, let's talk about just what the latest is from the Trump administration. I'm joined here in studio by our Washington correspondent, Daniel Bush. Daniel, thanks for being with us. Do we have any sense where the White House is on this? There were a flurry of messages from the president over the weekend. Obviously, he was at the hospital this morning getting his checkup, but there seems to be a bit of a lull period now.
That's right. There's a lot of activity over the weekend. The last couple of hours, the White House has been pretty quiet. President Trump was in a physical exam, his annual medical checkup for a couple of hours at Walter Reed. It's been quiet on the White House front. Perhaps the biggest indication coming from the Secretary of State, right, Marco Rubio, who said that this peace talk will take a couple of days to sort of finalize. In the past, in moments when the White House has been quiet, when President Trump is not posting on social media, that has sometimes been an indication of real progress being made. So we know that the U.S. is trying to make this final push. It's been complicated, obviously, by these strikes just yesterday. But these negotiations are ongoing. The White House is keeping sort of a quiet lid on it, which suggests that they are trying to get over the finish line.
And what sort of pressure is on the administration to get it over the finish line, as you say?
All sorts of pressure, and it's coming from all sides. Of course, Democrats who opposed this war from the beginning wanted to get wrapped up. Gulf state allies of the U.S. also want a resolution to this war. But interestingly, Katrina, there's also a lot of pressure from Republicans who are already ahead of this potential deal coming out, trying to signal to President Trump that they are not happy with it. Roger Wicker, the influential chairman of the Senate Armed Services Committee, saying that a sort of 60-day ceasefire, which has been rumored as part of this deal, would be a, quote, disaster. Lindsey Graham, another close ally of President Trump, saying that this sort of a deal might appease Iran, that it would strengthen Iran in the region, that it would be a nightmare for Israel, a close ally of the U.S. So there are Republicans that are pushing President Donald Trump not to give in to Iran and to carry out the case further militarily.
Yeah, we've heard that from Lindsey Graham a few times, haven't we? The other interesting thing from the posts over the weekend, and we should point out for those not watching us in America, it was a holiday weekend here, one of the major ones in the calendar, is this linkage from the president to a deal with Iran and a broader deal to get all of the countries in the region to sign up to the Abraham Accords to normalise their relations with Israel.
That's been such an interesting development here. This is an issue for President Trump that he sees as part of his legacy. I know White House officials that I've talked to say he is very, very focused on putting his stamp, not just here at home, but on foreign affairs, foreign policy. He sees the Abraham Accords, which he signed in his first term, as a lasting legacy, and he's trying to pressure allies in the region to join it, both as a way to expand the way that he's remade the region, and also to try and make whatever comes out of this Iran war a sort of lasting agreement. Now, it remains to be seen whether Saudi Arabia, whether Pakistan, who has been an important interlocutor in these talks, are willing to do that, under what terms. But this is President Trump going to partners in the region and saying, not only get on board with trying to end this war in Iran, but also with forging some sort of a broader peace that Trump can point to say, look at how I changed the region.
Well, we'll keep our eyes open for that one. Daniel Bush, thank you very much. That's Daniel Bush there, our Washington correspondent.
Let's bring in our panel now. Republican strategist and managing director of Nestpoint, John Thomas, as well as former Deputy Assistant Secretary of State and author Joel Rubin. John, coming to you first on this, just for an initial thought. We have heard that a deal is close a number of times before. Then we saw fresh US strikes, Iran saying today that it could retaliate forcefully. Where do you think this leaves prospects for peace anytime soon?
Well, I think it's actually broadly good in the sense of, remember, it was the U.S.'s pressure campaign that actually got Iran to come to the table to make a deal. And so I think what Trump and the U.S. is doing is remaining consistent in saying, look, if you continue to try to sabotage us or hurt us in any way, we're going to strike back unless you come and make a deal. So I think the continued pressure is favorable to get a resolution. But look, until this thing's done, it's not done.
And Joel, your thoughts on that? Do you think that continued pressure will yield results anytime soon?
Well, Helen, I think for President Trump, he has to have some kind of diplomatic gain to say this was worth it. And my fear is that he's going to go the route that we went with North Korea, for example, where several years ago when he traveled there, I think in 2019, he crossed over the DMZ. He met with Kim. They signed a few-page document a little bit later about a nuclear arrangement that ended up being useless. And that's the kind of half diplomacy that we may be heading towards, which is why you saw Roger Wicker and Lindsey Graham, for example, so concerned. They understand a partial half deal is not a good deal at all. Now, if they do come up after with a framework agreement that will lay out very specific objectives to negotiate over the next several months, I believe that could be a win. And that is something that we should be looking at as a positive outcome. But the idea that somehow we're going to have this all resolved, wrap it up in a bow, get the Abraham Accords signed, and peace in the Middle East is done overnight because the president says so, I think that's really far-fetched and frankly counterproductive to where he's trying to go on Iran.
And John, just on that point of the president attaching a plan to sort of get the Abraham Accord signed right through the region, is that too big of a project to essentially be biting off at this point when the global economy crisis is as it is?
It's a great question. I think the president's perspective here is that he has the leverage, or as he likes to say, he has all the cards. And so he's going to try to jam through his wish list of things. I mean, I don't know if he'll be able to achieve that. I know at the end of the day, if we've seen anything about President Trump, he does like to make deals. He doesn't like to leave things unresolved. So I know he's starting out there, and who knows, maybe he's also using it as an anchoring technique where he throws in the kitchen sink for his whole wish list only to come back to the core things that actually matter to the U.S. interest right now.
But John, do you think that President Trump holds all the cards at this point? I mean, before he went in on this joint mission with Israel into Iran, the Strait of Hormuz was open and everything was moving freely through it.
Well, we do have the cards in the sense that Iran is far worse off than we are. Certainly, it's causing problems in the energy markets, and President Trump's doing things to address that, both to grow our domestic energy and also to try to work to resolve the Strait of Hormuz. I'm not saying the U.S. isn't in pain, but on the scale of pain, Iran is effectively neutralized. Iran has to resolve this if they want their society to continue. We can sustain increased oil prices in the United States.
Joel, what do you make of that? Do you think Iran is effectively neutralized? They have, of course, discovered a massive lever when it comes to the Strait of Hormuz.
Regrettably, not if you ask the Iranians. They seem very happy, very comfortable in their position right now. That it doesn't mean they're not feeling pain. But remember, this is a dictatorship. They don't really care about how their people are suffering. They've shut off the internet now for over 2 months. The economy is in a shambles, but the leaders are fine. And that's the dynamic that we're confronting. And so for President Trump, unfortunately, he has used a military strategy and believed that that alone would resolve the issue, and it won't. So now he's backing into a diplomatic program, a political program, trying to mobilize our allies, all after the fact when he should have laid it out at the front end. And that means that diplomatically, we're in a twisted in knots. I'd like to say a diplomatic quagmire of our own making. And so the Iranians can just sit and watch, and even though they're going to suffer, they're not really going anywhere. And that's just the reality that we have to confront.
Well, gentlemen, stay with us. We've got much more to talk about. Let's also get the perspective now from retired Admiral John Miller, former commander of U.S. Naval Forces Central Command, as well as the U.S. Fifth Fleet. Welcome to you, Admiral. Good to have you on the programme. So on one hand, we were hearing over the course of the weekend, look, a deal could be near. Then overnight, these fresh US strikes during what's meant to be a ceasefire. How do you read what's going on?
Well, thanks for having me. What we've seen take place in the last 24 hours really helps us understand just how complicated the situation is and how tense things are with the ceasefire. And so there's a fragility to it that we all should continue to realize. In this particular case, we caught the Iranian regime trying to put mines into the Strait of Hormuz. That doesn't seem to be the action of a regime that's interested in negotiating the opening of the Strait of Hormuz. They took some action against some of our aircraft that were flying surveillance missions, my understanding, in international airspace. So it's going to be a difficult situation to get to something beyond the immediate ceasefire. It's a difficult situation to keep the ceasefire in place. I think both sides are motivated to do that. So we'll see these sort of dust-ups that no one wants to count as a violation of the ceasefire. But it's a difficult situation. And then once we get an agreement, the implementation is going to be difficult because the regime is notoriously dishonest. And so to get them to do the things that they agree to do is going to require vigilance for years and years.
And before we even get to that stage, how likely do you think is there the prospect that we could just see a return to all-out fighting here?
Well, I think we're about to get to a time frame where we understand just how serious the regime might be about negotiating. There's been some discussion about the fact that they're fragmented. There are different factions within the government. I'm not really a believer of that. I think the IRGC is firmly in control. They continue to motivate Hezbollah to attack in Lebanon, and they continue to be aggressive in the Gulf. So I'm not sure we're as close to a deal as we would like to think that we are. And there's a good possibility that we're actually going to have to force open the Strait of Hormuz in order to pave the way for future negotiations, which obviously have to include the nuclear material.
And what could that potentially look like? Would that mean US boots on the ground to do so, to force the reopening of the strait?
Well, Admiral Cooper, who's the military officer in charge of all of this, testified a couple of weeks ago on the Hill that he had the combat power to open the Strait of Hormuz. I think you can do that for the most part without boots on the ground. There may be some raids on some of the islands that are in the vicinity of the Strait of Hormuz, some raids into the land area that's along the Strait of Hormuz, but not certainly a large contingent of ground troops, not any kind of an invasion, but some raid activity to get after some of the small boats, the mines that they still have available to them. They certainly have some, and then the anti-ship cruise missiles and drones. But I think from a military standpoint, we can open the Strait of Hormuz. Admiral Cooper said we can, and I believe him. It'll be messy. It's a difficult operation. That doesn't mean it can't be done. And once that is done, then the regime's in an entirely different negotiating position. They think they have a little bit of time, but with the blockade, they don't. They have some time, but not too much. As Mr. Rubin pointed out, they don't care about the suffering of the people, but the regime itself only has so long where they can go without income, and the blockade is preventing them from getting that income that they need.
Can I just ask about the risks of going ahead with that operation? You said that it could be messy. Is there the potential here for further casualties, of course, both on both sides, including US military, when, of course, we know that there wasn't a congressional sign-off on this operation in the first place?
Well, forcefully opening the Strait of Hormuz would be a complex military operation, and there's risk to it. There's no doubt about that. And anytime you undertake a significant combat action, there's a risk of casualties, that you're going to lose some people. I think all of that factors into Admiral Cooper's calculations, and then therefore into the recommendations that he makes to the Secretary of War and to the President. We have been very effective in mitigating risks so far in this conflict from the U.S. military side, but we've also seen that it's not without risk, and that if you're going to be in combat, you put people at risk, and you do everything you can to mitigate that risk and maximize your opportunities for success.
And Admiral, that is the question of the Strait of Hormuz. Going beyond that and the question of a nuclear deal, defanging the nuclear program, what are the chances, do you think, that President Trump can walk away with a deal that actually goes beyond the one that was negotiated in 2015, that he can get anything more than that?
Well, the regime's not going to give up the nuclear material they have until they absolutely have to. And so it doesn't appear to me that they feel like they're in a position right now where they have to do that. So it continues to be a difficult negotiation. But at the end of all of this, the regime has to give up this nuclear material. Otherwise, we're threatened by the regime. The world is threatened by the regime far into the future. So there's no doubt if the regime had access to a nuclear weapon today, they would use it. If we leave them with the nuclear material, they'll continue to refine that in an effort to get a nuclear weapon. That can't be the final outcome. They've got to give up this nuclear material. They've got to give up a nuclear weapons program in order for us to move forward, for the whole world to move forward.
Retired Admiral John Miller there. Very good to have your thoughts. Thanks for being with us.
For having me.
Well, we'll be back in a moment to unpack all of that with our panel. But first, around the world and across the UK, this is BBC News. Welcome back to The Context USA. We've just been discussing the ongoing situation between the United States and Iran.
So let's bring in our panel again here and get their thoughts. Republican strategist John Thomas and former Deputy Assistant Secretary of State and author of the briefing book on Substack, Joel Rubin. Joel, just want to come to you first on something that the Admiral was mentioning there, the fragility of the ceasefire as it is, notwithstanding that strike by the US last night, which has been described as self-defense by the US. Just how, I suppose, many eggshells are the US treading on here in terms of preserving what is in existence, not to make things worse?
Well, Katrina, let's remember that this is a unilateral ceasefire where the United States, where we decided that we would no longer engage in offensive military activity. And then, of course, the Iranians followed suit. But there's not an official agreement signed that's leading to an end state. That's what they're trying to negotiate now. So it is inherently unstable. And it means that if the president starts to get a little bit itchy, if he's not happy with the way the negotiations are going, I would not put it at all past him to not conduct military strikes. In fact, I'm honestly surprised that he has not taken more strikes recently. Perhaps he felt like they were very close at the table to getting an agreement. But this means it could start up at any point. And one thing Helen mentioned, I want to bring this up as well, which is the question of authorization. Right now, the U.S. military is operating in this sort of no man's land of legal authority for the ongoing military operations if it were to restart. The 60-day clock under the War Powers resolution that expired. There's been no request for authorization by the administration. So our forces are just kind of sitting out there in a bit of a limbo. And if the president were to restart strikes and again, then tell Congress we're back again in military action, he could restart the clock for more fights in Congress. And so this is really uncharted territory politically as well for us here in Washington.
John, I want to ask what you make of the strategy that we're seeing from President Trump, because when I last checked his Truth Social, he'd put up a photo of himself with his slogan, peace through strength. Do you think that this is his version of peace through strength working? Do you think this approach will pay off?
I do, actually. I'm optimistic that if anybody can figure out a deal, it would be Secretary of State Rubio and President Donald Trump. The U.S. does want to come to a deal. I believe the U.S. has the leverage. And part of the reason I think why the Iranians were sneaking in mines in the Strait of Hormuz is because they have no leverage. They have to recapture leverage in this process. And that's by sneaking things into the one thing of value they have, which is the Strait of Hormuz. So, look, I think a deal can come here, but it's delicate. It's fragile. I'm not sure. I'm also not sure I agree with Joel's perspective that the Iranian regime can just wait it out forever. Like the Admiral said, they'll be starved out with money. And quite frankly, they run the risk, the military risk, that we kill them all. So I don't think they can wait this out forever. Yeah. And that's why I think the U.S. has the leverage here.
John, can I just ask, though, you were saying that you think that the U.S. has further leverage. What kind of leverage does it have beyond further military action, particularly as we approach the midterms and at a time when this conflict is proving unpopular?
Sure. Well, we have sanctions, other economic sanctions that we can levy. We've applied pressure on neighboring countries not to supply Iran. But you're right. I guess the main pressure points that Iran has is political. But if there were ever a time that a U.S. president cared less about political pressure internally, it would be President Trump. He is different than the standard breed of U.S. president in his ability to withstand political pain, juxtaposed to standard American presidents.
That is a true statement indeed. I want to bring in Frank Lowenstein at this point, former U.S. Special Envoy for Middle East Peace. He was there just a few years ago. Frank, thanks very much for joining us. Just want to get what's your take on where we're at with these negotiations at the moment and then those sort of self-defensive strikes from the U.S. yesterday.
Yeah, well, I think it's pretty clear that President Trump would like to end this war. I think the Iranians would too. The problem for Trump is that the military campaign really hasn't achieved its core objectives. The regime remains in place. The nuclear program is more or less intact, and they've reconstituted the ballistic missile program. So it's difficult for him to explain, what he's achieved over the period of the last 2 or 3 months. At the same time, it's really not clear that any further military pressure is going to change Iran's calculus. And we bombed them for 39 days, and they didn't really move off of their core position. So not clear that additional military campaign will change the bottom line. So I think Trump is looking for at the least bad option here, which is to have a ceasefire. Strait of Hormuz opens, the blockade is removed, and then they have 30 to 60 days to negotiate on the core issues. And I think that's what both sides are trying to get to now.
Some of the criticism, though, coming from even within the Republican Party in that 30 to 60-day window is the central question of, can the US trust Iran?
Yeah, absolutely. And the answer is no. Nobody should trust Iran. And the problem for the United States fundamentally is that once we've agreed to end the war, we really lose all our leverage in the negotiations. At that point, we're just sort of offering sanctions relief and maybe unfreezing of frozen funds in return for Iran making what they will view as significant concessions on the nuclear file. So I think what war hawks on Iran are concerned about is that there will be no deal at the end of this, and Iran will emerge from it in a strategically stronger position than they were when the war started.
And on what we've heard, Frank, over the weekend from President Trump about trying to somehow tie the Abraham Accords, a wider rollout of that to this deal, is that likely, do you think?
No, I don't think that really bears any resemblance to reality in the Middle East right now. I don't think the Saudis are interested in that, the Qataris, Pakistanis, anybody else at this point. I think what Trump's largely trying to do there is to float the possibility that this might all turn out very well.
Frank, sorry for interrupting you. Just pause that thought for one moment, because I do want to say goodbye to our viewers on PBS and thank you for being with us. And now, Frank, you can carry on with your point. Sorry for that interruption.
No, not at all. So, yeah, I think Trump floated that to put in people's mind the possibility that there might be a very good outcome here. Notwithstanding the fact that the war hasn't really achieved its core objectives. I think it would be great for Prime Minister Netanyahu politically if he could point to that as a possible outcome to the war. But really, there's no chance it's actually going to happen on the ground. So this is really a messaging effort by President Trump that's sort of disconnected from reality.
And when Marco Rubio says he thinks a deal can be done in the next few days, based on your experience, is that likely?
Yeah, well, I think if they're going to reach a deal, it will happen in the next couple of days. Obviously, there's been some skirmishes around the Strait of Hormuz right now. In my experience and with prior ceasefires, that shouldn't get in the way of reaching a final deal. But at the same time, if either side is getting cold feet, that can provide an excuse to sort of back away from the negotiations. I think the bigger issue is in Lebanon right now. The Iranians are insisting that Lebanon be part of this ceasefire. And Prime Minister Netanyahu has made very clear that he has every intention of continuing that war. So I think the main hurdle they need to overcome, and I think really both sides would have to be engaged on this. The Iranians would have to tell Hezbollah to back off, and Trump would have to tell Netanyahu to back off, in hopes that you could calm that situation down enough to allow the broader negotiations with Iran to move forward.
OK. Frank Lowenstein, former US Special Envoy for Middle East Peace, thank you very much for joining us, covering a lot of ground there in terms of that Iran-US deal and also that situation in Lebanon. Of course, those Israeli-Lebanon talks are due to get underway again, a fourth round of them later this week here in Washington, D.C.
We are watching BBC News. This is The Context USA. Katrina and I will be back on the other side of a short break. Stay with us. Hello and welcome back to The Context USA with me, Helena Humphrey in London.
And me, Katrina Perry in Washington. NASA says construction of a new base at the lunar South Pole will begin over the next 7 years, establishing a permanent human presence on the moon.
Well, we'll have more on that a little later, but first it feels that there's always someone somewhere going to the polls in the United States, and today we are looking once again at Texas as Republicans are voting to pick their candidate to contest a Senate seat.
Now, what makes this race really interesting is that President Trump has chosen not to endorse the four-term sitting Republican Senator John Cornyn, but rather he's thrown his weight behind the challenger candidate, the current state Attorney General Ken Paxton.
Now, neither candidate got enough votes in the original primary election in March to move forward as the party's candidate, so they face a second round or runoff election today.
The winner will face the Democratic candidate for Senate, James Tallarico, a current state representative in Texas, in the overall election for the Senate in November. Now, we'll hear a little bit more from Texas later on, but first let's hear from our panel as we'll bring them in. We have with us John Thomas and Joel Rubin. And John, I'll go to you first because you are a Texan, so you have an insight here. What's your sense of where this is going? Is it kind of a referendum on President Trump amongst the Republican Party in Texas?
A little bit. This is an incredibly interesting race. I just cast my ballot this morning. And, you know, a lot of people are looking at President Trump. He was under a lot of pressure from the establishment within the Republican Party to endorse the incumbent, John Cornyn. He even was coming so close as to right after the initial primary, he allegedly had a drafted tweet in favor of endorsing Cornyn, and he pulled it, only to turn around a few weeks later and endorse Ken Paxton. And so people are wondering what happened there. I think a little bit more simplistic view might be appropriate here. Post the initial primary, we have a 60-day runoff period, which is what we're at today. And really, if you look at polling, irrespective of President Trump, Paxton was ahead anywhere between 5 to 15 points. So Paxton was likely to be the nominee. It just made it spicier that President Trump finally decided to weigh in and probably end this runoff in favor of Paxton.
Well, there is plenty of spice in American politics, as it is, John, isn't there? Without adding extra spice here and there along the way. But
yes.
Joel, I'll come back to you in a moment. I just want to head down to Dallas now because we have Bloomberg's Texas bureau chief with us there, Julie Fine, who has been monitoring the minutiae of this. Julie, how are things looking today? I know there was a record turnout for the first primary, even though neither candidate got over the line, so to speak. How are things looking today?
Well, obviously, in the primaries in general, there is a lower turnout than there are in the general elections, especially in a presidential election. However, both candidates are very hopeful that they can turn out some numbers today. One thing that's working in their favor, it's a beautiful day here, no rain. It's not too hot. So they're hoping they can get enough people out. Here is really the situation here. The way the primary works in the state of Texas, if you voted in the Democratic primary, you cannot vote in this runoff. If you voted in the Republican primary, you can vote in the runoff. If you didn't vote in either, you can vote in the runoff. So what John Cornyn is hoping today is that people who did not vote in the primary really get out there in this runoff, because Ken Paxton does have a lead in the polls, and that was before he was endorsed by President Trump.
Is it realistic of John Cornyn to think that he can beat Ken Paxton today, as you say, with that endorsement and with all that's gone on?
Well, certainly things are leaning in Ken Paxton's favor. However, John Cornyn has been a senator. He's been there for 4 terms. He has the establishment behind him. He has the money behind him. He's greatly outraised Ken Paxton. However, Ken Paxton, with fewer dollars, has managed to get better numbers in the polls. However, if you do remember from the original primary, John Cornyn edged out Ken Paxton by more than a point. It was close, but he did have that edge. He's hoping that will continue this time around.
And does John Cornyn and his supporters feel a little bit hard done by in terms of not getting the president's endorsement and some of the comments the president has made about him recently? I mean, he has been quite loyal to President Trump.
He's voted with him more than 95% of the time. I believe it's 99% of the time. What's very curious about this is right after the primary, President Trump said he was going to endorse, and reports were that he was going to endorse John Cornyn. So obviously this was a blow to a campaign that was seeing its numbers not as high as Ken Paxton's.
And Julie, the other, I suppose, point to mention is waiting for whoever gets over the line today is the Democratic Senate candidate, Tallarico, waiting there patiently, already able to campaign, knowing that he is the candidate. What kind of race is being set up here?
Well, that's what's very interesting. While the two Republican candidates have been going at it, James Tallarico can simply raise money. He's shown that he has been able to do that. However, he has not been tested that much besides the Democratic primary. Now he's going to go up against a Republican. You're going to see this race really begin here. James Tallarico has a very good reputation in the state house here in Texas. However, Republicans are going to say that he is too liberal for Texas. We'll see how that plays out.
Exciting, spicy times ahead today and the next few months. Julie Fine, there, Bloomberg's Texas Bureau Chief. Thank you for joining us here on BBC News.
Well, let's bring back in our panel then. Joel, coming to you on all of this, how do you think the Democrats are watching this? Do you think they have a preferred Republican candidate to come out of this?
Yeah, Helen, it's a win-win, quite frankly, because first of all, we should remember that John Cornyn might be the #1 fundraiser for Senate Republicans outside of Mitch McConnell, who's also retiring. Cornyn has raised about $400 million. So if he goes down with the help of Donald Trump, that only helps Democrats in terms of recapturing the Senate. And in terms of Texas, look, Paxton is a very damaged candidate. He is a toxic brand. And Democrats, we feel like we have a possible winner here. And this is going to mobilize a lot of support nationally. It's going to raise a lot of money, but it's also going to cost Republicans. This is not a race where they should be spending money. It's like Democrats having to spend a lot of money to keep a seat in California. It's a waste. So that's going to suck more energy out of the Republicans. Tallarico is a very attractive candidate. Paxton will carry a lot of baggage, and it will be after a vicious primary. So we'll see how this turns out. But either which way, this is a net positive for Democrats.
Yeah, as you say, got to see which way that primary shakes out first. We do just want to bring you some other election-related developments first, because we've spoken a lot about redistricting on this programme. Today, a federal district court has blocked Alabama from using a new congressional map, which was agreed by lawmakers in 2023.
Yeah, the court labelled the plan, which includes one majority black district, as racially discriminatory. The three-judge court ordered Alabama to continue with a court-selected map that had been used in the 2024 election cycle that included two majority black districts.
Now, the court found that Alabama state lawmakers had changed their map in order to, as they wrote, distribute black voters across districts to dilute their votes, at least in part because they were black.
However, the state can now appeal this decision to the Supreme Court. Let's bring back in our panel, John Thomas and Joel Rubin. We've spoken a lot about redistricting on this programme, and some would say in this cycle, John, it started in Texas. And I just want to go back to something Joel said there. Do you think Democrats can win a Senate seat in Texas this year?
I struggle to see that. I thought Joel's analysis was fairly good, but I would quibble with a couple points. One is, yes, is this runoff or general election going to be more expensive than it otherwise had to be if Cornyn was on the ballot? Absolutely. But I also would say what we saw with Beto O'Rourke, the former Democratic nominee for the U.S. Senate in Texas a few years ago, is Democrats get worked up into a lather at the potential of flipping Texas blue, which means small dollar donors, Democrats, and big dollar donor Democrats are going to be pouring money into Tallarico, money they otherwise could have put in competitive Senate seats that might have been better well spent. So, look, it's going to be a free-for-all. Paxton's only choice is to define Tallarico early, and by that, that's nice political speak of getting nasty and quick. So it's going to be as a political operative, it's going to be fun to watch that all play out.
Joel, I noticed a smile and a nod from you there. Your thoughts?
Yeah, no, look, John's right. I mean, this is definitely going to mobilize a lot of voters. But the good thing about small dollar donors is you can keep on going back to them for small dollar contributions. And, one thing to watch, and this is a big X factor, is the Latino vote. The Latino vote in 2024 did well for President Trump. That's how he ended up winning the White House. But the numbers have flipped overnight, basically, since his policies have come into force, in particular related to ICE. We've seen Latino voters flee the Republican Party, and that is a huge demographic within Texas. And that's really where this race will likely be determined. And I think it's very much up for grabs.
John, what's your view on that, the role of the Latino voters, not just in Texas, but more broadly across the country?
Oh, yeah, I completely agree with Joel. That's going to be the swing demographic that's likely going to decide this contest. And that's why you're going to see Republicans and Ken Paxton go in hard against Tallarico on the issue of culture wars. That's where there is a distinguishing difference between Democrats and Republicans is on cultural and social issues. So I think you're going to see that Republicans are going to try to go early in defining Tallarico as extreme and woke and different on their social issues. And that's the attack zone. I think that actually will resonate quite well because even though Tallarico initially might look good on paper, most Texans don't know who he is. And so that means the first person to introduce new information and define him has a distinct edge. So, and I think that's what Paxton and the Republicans are going to work to do.
Joel, what do you make of that? Do you think Democrats are ready to go toe-to-toe when it comes to that issue of culture wars? It had been brought up in that DNC autopsy. What do you think?
Yeah, let's not talk about the autopsy, okay? Look, when it comes to Tallarico, that's one of his special ingredients as the candidate that he brings, which is he is, I believe, a pastor. He speaks very much with the language of the evangelical community. He is proudly wearing his religiosity on his sleeve. And so while there are going to be attacks against him, certainly we should expect it. He may have a bit more armor. And he's been able to communicate in ways that is very appealing to undecided voters and certainly to people who care about faith as an issue. And to call him woke and out of the mainstream and then to hear him talk. And with all that money coming in, they'll hear him talk. I think he has a chance to respond to that effectively.
Well, indeed, an interesting contest in Texas ahead, which we will be watching closely on this programme over the next few months. John, Joel, stay with us. Lots more still to come around the world and across the UK. This is BBC News.
This is incredible. He's looking at us. Oh, what does his foot mean? Did you see that? That means charge. No? Not yet.
With every beat and whistle, these orbs pulse and vibrate, letting deaf audiences feel the rhythm and emotion.
Well, this is the view I've woken up to this morning, the Gisar Reserve in the south of Uzbekistan.
Showing me the ropes is Mehmet Usta, a baklava master. Oh my goodness. Why have I spent years kneading my own dough when I could have just stood on it in my kitchen?
You can try.
I can try.
I haven't even come that far yet, and it's quite physical work, I've got to say. And the most scary thing is when you first put your weight fully in the harness.
Inspiring travel. Watch now on BBC iPlayer.
You're watching The Context USA on BBC News now. The US space agency NASA says it's planning to establish a permanent base on the moon. It says astronauts could be able to live there for months at a time in just 7 years from now.
Well, the lunar base would act as both a hub for research and a launch pad for future missions into deep space, including manned flights to Mars. Well, let's take a listen now to some of what the head of NASA's Artemis program, Laurie Glaze, had to say.
With Moonbase, Artemis astronauts will stay longer, explore farther, and conduct the kinds of science that advances exploration itself, understanding how humans operate off-world, how we build infrastructure, and how we prepare for Mars. As you'll hear from Carlos in a moment, only 2 months after ignition, we are already taking concrete steps through new procurement awards and new partnerships to turn this vision into a reality. We are building humanity's first outpost beyond Earth. Through Artemis we are going, and with Moonbase we're going to stay. And together, NASA, industry, and international partners, we are creating a future where exploration is not just an incredible moment in history, but the first foothold beyond Earth for all of humanity.
Well, listening to all of that, our panel, John and Joel. John, what do you make of it? Would you fancy an outpost on the moon? Would you take a trip?
I think it's fantastic. Not sure I want to be the first person to test it out,
Fair.
But eventually I'm happy to be there. But I think this really underscores something bigger for the United States, which is the new frontier is, in fact, space. Elon Musk has even said perhaps our data centers for AI need to be in outer space to offset the energy needs that might be problematic here domestically back on Earth. And also, there's just unknown opportunities. So it's great to see the U.S. leading into it. And the last is for defense purposes. The more we own outer space, the better off the U.S. might be to defend the United States and keep the rest of the world safe.
Joel, are we facing into a sort of era of space wars here? I mean, who owns the moon? We can't agree on who owns parts of the Earth. We're setting ourselves up for a tremendous intergalactic row here.
Yeah, look, Katrina, we have been looking at space now. We have a unified military command looking at space. There's a lot of questions about potential hostile activity in space. And so the rules of the road have not yet been established. Certainly, it's a race to the moon, right? We saw that back during the Cold War in the 60s. And I think we're in that zone again. I hope that it remains peaceful. To John's point, a lot of our defense technology was developed through our civilian investments in the space program, our missile technology. In particular, there's a lot of crossover between the military and the civilian side. And so this is a new territory. And I am very excited about it, about the idea of a moon base. And I hope that it is used for peaceful purposes and that we can work with our partners around the world to make sure that the international effort maintains peace and stability in the outer space.
John, if I'm maybe so blunt about all of this, is this essentially just about China?
Yes, I think everything's about China. But this is in particular. Yes, that's right. We need to be first to claim territory. And it also helps aid U.S. companies like SpaceX and others that are trying to be first early adopters to try to claim space. So, yes, I believe it is about China.
Really, really good to get your thoughts. Let's take a look at another issue now, because as we reported at the very beginning of the show, President Trump has had his annual medical checkup today, and a few hours later he posted on Truth Social saying that everything checked out perfectly.
Donald Trump is, of course, the oldest US president ever to take the oath of office, and he faces ongoing scrutiny as he is approaching his 80th birthday in just a couple of weeks.
And it is his third medical examination since returning to office last year, and follows mounting speculation about issues including bruising on his hands and apparent sleepiness during meetings.
President Trump has also spoken dozens of times about how he has aced a cognitive test that he claims his presidential predecessors have not taken. Well, let's get the views now of our panelists who are still with us, John and Joel. Joel, do you think there should be a greater transparency about these tests, what is being examined, what the real results are? I mean, there was obviously a lot of controversy about Joe Biden's fitness for office, and we're seeing that now with Donald Trump as well.
Yeah, Katrina, I'm very uncomfortable with the idea that the president is the person describing his own health to the world and that we should just take it on face value. You know, we need to have some confidence that our leaders are healthy and up to the job. Now, President Trump, I'm not going to say he's not up to the job, but he is also, when he's falling asleep at meetings and when he walks in with his hands bruised, as you've described, we need to know what's going on. And I will also say to my party, I'm not going to say this is one party problem. With President Biden and the concerns that were expressed about his health, I wish we had been more transparent. I do wish that there had been some kind of independent doctor or medical examiner that didn't just report to the president and say everything's fine here, because we know in retrospect that things were not what they should have been. And I think that that, frankly, is a harm to the country as a whole. So we need more transparency is my bottom line.
So, Joel, sorry, if I'm interpreting it correctly there, you think it shouldn't be the White House doctor who does these exams, but it should be someone completely independent or a commission, perhaps, of several individuals?
Yeah, look, you know, Katrina, it's fine to have a White House doctor. Of course, you should have a White House doctor. But, you know, that's like me going to my personal physician who I've been friends with for years and saying, can you please just write that note to say I'm okay to play softball around the corner even when my elbow hurts? He'll say, sure, of course, why not? You know, I think we need to have somebody that is clear and independent and not reporting to the president, that can give an honest assessment. Remember, the president works for us, and that means we need to have clarity. We don't need to have his in-house doctor telling us that everything is fine.
John, of course, we all remember very well that Republicans spent years arguing that concerns about Biden's age were legitimate and having that conversation out in the open. Do you think it's fair then that similar scrutiny is being applied to President Trump?
I think it's completely appropriate. And I think every president should be under that scrutiny. I mean, if you had an independent doctor, as Joel described, that doctor might be the most powerful person in the entire world. I'm not so sure that we want to entrust that level of power to one independent doctor. We have elections. That's the whole point of elections, is to let the voters decide, do they think the person is up to the job? I think the difference between President Trump and President Biden is really apples and oranges. We saw with our own two eyes that President Biden didn't even start his day until 10:30, 11 in the morning, had a press lid by 2 p.m. most days. There wasn't much going on from the administration, juxtaposed to President Trump that I don't know when the man sleeps. That's my bigger concern, is I don't think he's getting enough sleep. But if we start seeing that Americans believe the job isn't being done, that he isn't showing up to the office, then I think the pressure is warranted. But to worry that he's having an MRI scan and not releasing that scan, I'm not too worried about that.
I would have to say that there are going to be a lot of people out there who are watching President Trump physically and in his meetings, and they are coming up with a very similar critical analysis to what John just did on President Biden. And it doesn't mean that an independent doctor decides whether or not the gentleman can continue to serve in the White House. It means that independent doctor is telling the American people what is going on with the health of that person sitting in the Oval Office.
Indeed. Well, we will be awaiting the actual readout and the medical report from that assessment that President Trump had at the Walter Reed Hospital today. We haven't been provided with that just yet, but it is tradition that is made public either later today or in the days ahead, and we will be reporting on that accordingly. But for now, we're out of time for today. Just want to say thank you very much to Republican strategist John Thomas. Thank you very much for joining us, as well as to Joel Rubin, author of The Briefing book on Substack. We have lots more still to come here on BBC News, so do stay with us. And from Helena and I, thank you so much for watching.